Hello macroeconomics students. This week we're looking at the homework for Chapter 11, which is Fiscal Policy, the actions of the government in changing taxes and spending. We're going to start with the consumption function that's given to us. We have an autonomous consumption value of 800 billion. We have a 0.8 MPC, or marginal propensity to consume. And given this information, we were asked to determine how much different events would stimulate the economy. So what they're asking is, by how much will aggregate demand at current prices shift before the multiplier sets in? So it helps to see how aggregate demand is a combination of the different components. So aggregate demand is consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports. So as we're going through this, we can see how each of these will affect aggregate demand. So the first one is a $50 billion increase in government purchases. Well, as you can see, government purchases are a component of aggregate demand. So that's going to be a direct effect of $50 billion. B is a $15 billion tax cut. A tax cut is not one of these components directly, but it will affect consumption. However, a tax cut will not necessarily just go all to consumption. So we're going to use our propensity, marginal propensity to consume, to understand how a tax cut will affect consumption. So we're going to take our MPC, which is 0.8, and we're going to multiply it by, in this case, the $50 billion tax cut, and that value will give us how many billions the effect on consumption and therefore aggregate demand will be. C says a $50 billion increase in income transfers. Income transfers work in a similar fashion. They are subject to that marginal propensity to consume. Just because somebody has a tax cut and more money in their pocket, or an income transfer that they receive more money in their pocket that way, does not mean they're going to rush out and spend every penny in consumption. However, we say that our marginal propensity to consume is going to affect that. Therefore, we're going to take that marginal propensity times the size of, in this case, the income transfers, and that's going to give us the value of the income transfers. All right, now the question next becomes, what will the cumulative AD shift be? Cumulative means after the multiplier effect. So here we're going to want to know our multiplier. And we know that our multiplier is calculated as 1 over the marginal propensity to save, or 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So in this case, if our MPC is 0.8, then our MPS must be 0.2, and we get a multiplier of 5. So if we know our multiplier is 5, then we can take our increase in government spending, and it was 50 billion, multiply that by the 5, and we get a 250 billion. So we just take the original amount, change that, 50 times our multiplier. The tax cut, we're going to do something similar. However, we're going to only use the 40 billion, right? Because it's 0.8 times 50. So it has an impact of 40 billion. So we're going to take our 40 billion, and we're going to still use our same multiplier, is in effect, and we're going to do that with the tax cut. And the increase in transfers down here is the same thing. We're going to take the 40 billion, because it's 0.8 times 50 billion, and we're going to multiply that times the multiplier as well. So pretty straightforward. Watch out though, make sure you recognize that your numbers are likely to be different than mine. All right, next one is the government decides to increase taxes by 40 billion in order to increase Social Security benefits by the same, and the MPC is 0.9. And the question is, what will happen to aggregate demand? Well, here's what's going to happen here. They're going to increase taxes by 40 billion, and they're going to increase transfers. Social Security benefits are transfers. So if transfers are increased by 40 billion, it's going to be 40 billion times the MPC, and that's going to be the effect on aggregate demand. Ultimately, it will change the consumption. And then if they transfer those payments, so increased taxes will work the other way. So if they transfer that money in, that'll increase aggregate demand. However, if they tax the money away, that's going to decrease consumption, and it's going to be the same calculations, 40 times the MPC, and in this case, it's going to decrease aggregate demand by the same amount. And the reason it's the same amount is because transfers have the same effect as tax changes on aggregate demand. So in this case, no change. So watch out for that one again. You probably have different values you're working with. Number 4 is a graphing one, and this asks you to recognize quantity at equilibrium and quantity at full employment. And so it asks you to identify the macro equilibrium. So in this case, the equilibrium can be pretty easily seen right here at a price level of 4 and a GDP of 14. And you'll notice that that is not the full employment equilibrium. So that's not the it's not equilibrium at all. It's the macro equilibrium, but it's not the full employment or long run aggregate supply level, which is going to be here. I made a mess of it. And so we found the macro equilibrium. It says the current macro equilibrium when real GDP is at, in this case, 14 billion. You can see that on the graph pretty readily. The real GDP gap is, and we can see that again, it's the real GDP gap is from what would be full employment to 14, so 4 billion. The AD excess is a little bit interesting concept, a little bit different than you might expect. And here's how we're going to see that. We're going to go to the gap between this and this at full employment. So it's a little hard to read, but the gap here is what we're looking at, the aggregate demand excess. And so it's going to be where aggregate demand and aggregate supply differ at the equilibrium output at full employment. Okay, so the excess is from here to here. So measurably, you can see it if you read closely, it's 10 and 17. So in this case, the excess is 7 billion, aggregate demand excess. So watch for that on your graph. It's a little tricky, but you can find that excess where there's a difference between aggregate demand and aggregate supply at the full employment equilibrium, or value rather. And it says now identify the new equilibrium that would occur with an appropriate fiscal policy. And equilibrium with an appropriate fiscal policy would shift it to full employment. So the full employment GDP is 10 billion. And you'll put in your happy little graph there, full employment. So that's pretty easy to do. You just have to read the graph carefully, and again, watch out for those numbers. Number 6 gives you an aggregate demand shortfall of 100 billion, marginal propensity to consume of 0.8, and asks you to do a little bit of calculation here. So let's start with finding out the multiplier, because what we want to know is how much stimulus is going to be needed to close that gap of 100 billion. And we know that the multiplier effect does affect the total in change. So we want to know what the multiplier is so we don't overstimulate the economy. So 1 over the MPS would be 1 over 2.2, and that means our multiplier here is 5. So if we want to close that gap of 100 billion, and we know we have a multiplier of 5, then the fiscal stimulus we want is going to be $20 billion. The tax cut, now the tax cut, we're going to use a multiplier of 4. And the tax multiplier, there's 2 ways of recognizing it. It's either the normal multiplier minus 1, or you can calculate it as MPC over MPS. Either way, we're going to get a value of 4, right? Because MPC is 0.8, 0.2, 4, or we can take the regular multiplier, subtract 1. And the reason that the tax multiplier is less is because the assumption is that a portion of that might be saved, because people don't fully feel confident that that's money in their pockets to keep. So the income tax then, if we assume a tax multiplier of 4, is to close that gap, needs to be 25 billion. And it says, alternatively, how much more government spending would achieve the target. And remember, government spending is part of that aggregate demand formula. So it's consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports. So if we want to achieve that target of closing that gap of 100 billion, let me get the numbers right here. We have that multiplier in place, so it's going to be 20 billion. So if we plug that 20 billion in with a multiplier of 5, it'll raise aggregate demand ultimately by as much as 100 billion. Number 10 is, hang on a minute, 10, 12, okay. Let's see. 10 is the data from the table here. And, oh, this one, that's right. This one is actually really straightforward. You literally pull the numbers from the table. So according to CBO's low estimates, how many jobs and millions were created in the 2009 fiscal stimulus package in 2009? Low estimates, well, here it is. Increase in jobs, low estimate, 0.2 million. You literally just read the numbers from the table. So this one, I hesitated to even leave in, but you might wonder if you see it and go, could it be that easy? Yeah, I could. All right, number 12. This one's a little tricky because it asks you to recognize some information from the graph. So I'm going to show you how it works on this version of it, and then hopefully it'll help. So in this case, they go from, they look at a direct impact of a rise in government spending of 200 billion. And then they notice that indirect is because of that multiplier effect. Ultimately, it is an increase in an additional 600 billion. So it goes from 200 billion originally to a total of 800, right? 600 plus 200. So 200 to 800 billion is what they're asking you to see. So from this information, hello AP. Hello macroeconomics students. This week we're looking at Chapter 11 homework dealing with fiscal policy, and that's the actions of the government in changing taxes and government expenditures to achieve Hello macroeconomics students. This week we're looking at Chapter 11 homework dealing with fiscal policy, changes in government spending and taxes in order to affect changes in aggregate demand. Okay, so we can find the equilibrium GDP pretty easily where supply is equal to demand, so that's not so bad. If full employment occurs at a real output level of 910, how large is the gap? Well, the gap is between 910 and 800, so 110. And then C says if aggregate demand increases enough to restore full employment, what will the price level be? Well, if we're going back, and they just said full employment at 910, what would the price level be at 910? Well, in this chart, it's 70. So that one's just a matter of reading, doing a little basic calculation. And this last one is a repeat of something we did in, gosh, way back in chapter 1. And this wants you to recognize that you've got a new mixture of output. We're supposed to assume the economy is currently at point, I believe it's A. I can't read it there, but it's A, I think. So we're supposed to assume we're there. And then there's a highway construction project, and the economy is stimulated through highway construction. And the mixture, the question here is what would happen to the mixture? Well, highway construction is a public good, so we're going to move closer towards more public goods as we bring on that project. And we're going to bring, in this case, to point B would be our change. And the mix of output would move away from private goods and move more towards public. I don't think I have any trouble with that, but I thought I'd offer that. All right, so this is Chapter 11. I wish you lots of luck, and we'll see you in Chapter 13 next week.